Welcome back or welcome to the Time-Crunched Cyclist podcast. I'm your host, Coach Adam Pulford. Today, we're going to tear into the differences between training for gravel versus road racing and discuss how you can organize your training to do each one more effectively. And to do that, I've got our resident nutrition guru and gravel racing expert, CTS Coach Jason Siegle. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so where are you podding from today? Where are you at?
I'm based out of Santa Monica.
Very cool. Where it's always sunny and 68 degrees, huh?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, good weather. You generally don't have to check the weather a whole lot.
Yeah, which is very important for bikes. Well, Jason, I've been working alongside you at camps and everything coaching related for about 10 years now. But for our audience who may not know you as well, could you introduce yourself a bit more to our listeners?
Yeah, sure. I've been a coach for CTS for over a decade, like you say, and I also raced professionally in mountain biking and gravel. So have a long history of doing that stuff as well, and feel like that applies pretty strongly to the conversation we're about to have.
That it does, yeah. And you've got a pretty strong nutrition background as well. I mean, is there any consonants after your name in that regard, or are you just
No, I think it's just I just dig into all those details and try to stay as abreast of what's going on in the science and literature, just to first is for my own sake, and then for the sake of all my athletes and helping their performance. So it's more and more it seems to be an important role that at the top level of sports gets really picked at really strongly these days.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's good too. I mean, to be able to talk about all of these aspects, because there's going to be a major kind of fueling component to what we talk about in part two. But yeah, for our audience, I mean, Jason, like I said, he's been coaching forever, and he's a go-to coach for us when we get stumped nutritionally. So can't wait to hear and learn from him today. But what I'd like to do is walk through some of the main differences between gravel and road racing so that our listeners can get a good understanding of how the demands of each discipline can lead to better training and fueling decisions. And that ultimately will go into increasing their performance, as well as, let's just face it, the fun factor of any event that you go out and toe the line at. Additionally, I think it's helpful when you observe the demands of the races kind of like more objectively, rather than how hard or just like how epic something is. The athlete can then help understand why we're doing what we're doing as coaches, both in training and fueling. Would you agree with that?
The main things that are important here is in gravel, they all tend to be long, although now we're seeing just so many people come into it that there's like 3 or 4 distances that are available, but still like the premier distances at any of these races tend to be 100 or 100 plus, where that isn't always the case with road racing, particularly if you're not male. So, for the female side of this equation, gravel races are generally quite a bit longer than anything they would do. So the volume of what we're training is definitely a key component. Also, that aerobic side, which goes in, ties in directly with the length, are pretty key. I'd say that's at the base level, that's probably the biggest difference. Then I guess it just depends on the individual level of like how they're treating the event. Are they trying to win the race, or are they trying to complete it? And those end up being the biggest differences that you see. Is if you're just trying to complete it, you're going to pace very different than if you're trying to win the race. So it makes training change quite a bit.
Yeah, exactly. And I think too, just like for everything that we have to talk about today, I think it's best to split it up into two episodes. So the first, we'll talk about those differences, road versus gravel. We'll talk about training implications and some key workouts. And Jason, how just like what you were saying with like the duration and maybe, men versus women's fields, how that can change there a little bit. And then the second part will be all about fueling, nutrition, hydration, and maybe some, if we have time for it, some of the actual environmental factors too. So, yeah, you already kind of mentioned this already. You said, gravel is generally longer, but what are some of those main differences if you can contrast just general gravel racing to general road racing?
Well, I mean, I guess in general, you're going to have a gravel race tends to be more of a race of attrition than it is like a road race where you'll have some team tactics, really aggressive guys going off the front early and getting in and establishing a breakaway. In gravel, because of that lack of team to a certain degree, at least at the front, no one wants to let anyone get up the road, or it's just doesn't seem to end up working out. Usually the front keeps working hard enough that it's just little by little the field gets shrunk, and whether that's because of a technical feature or just pure strength. Usually it's the strongest guys are all left at the end, where sometimes in a road race you have a winner that isn't the strongest, they just got in the right move. So, but the biggest is the sort of pacing. Like usually they're long enough that you're not racing well above your threshold early. It's hard, but it's a little more like, hey, we got, if it's unbound, which is 200 miles, there's a little bit, hey, we got 9, 10, 11 more hours to go, even for the fastest people. So that changes how aggressive you're going to start the race off.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, that same rule applies for, if you're just going to finish the event, right? Like, not aiming for that, that first place top podium spot. It's just super long. So you can't, it's less dynamic and kind of the way I look at it, right? Because pacing is critical, the nutrition is critical, like we'll talk about, but it's longer. So I think from a very simplistic standpoint, you have to pace more wisely and you have to go less hard.
Yeah, you end up pacing for like for talking watts, you'd be more hoping to pace the wattage that you can do for the entire duration versus faster at the front half and slower at the second, just because they're so long. Like if you go slower later, you're quite a bit slower, and that hurts you. So I like using the example of like Eliud Kipchoge running 2 hour marathon, and you look at what the pacing strategy is for someone doing that, and it's even pacing. And if by chance you have the gumption to give extra at the end to like maybe slightly pick it up, fantastic. But otherwise, rather err on doing a pace that you can hopefully do the entire day versus kind of crumbling in the second half.
Yeah, exactly. So I think, when it comes into these generally longer races, even pacing, being able to be more durable throughout the event, meaning, as strong at the end as you were at the beginning, or maybe a slight kick if you got it, right? What kind of like what energy systems are needed for that? Like, what are you training in the athlete to make them more durable, to establish good pacing patterns, that kind of stuff? Like, what's the main
It
energy systems?
Well, I mean, it's mainly, it's aerobic energy and
Yep.
the ability to utilize fat for the pace that they're doing. So if we can increase their ability or increase the pace at which they're able to utilize fat as the primary fuel source, that's going to allow them to sustain that pace for longer. So I say we sort of attack that kind of two ways, because I think we still think of threshold intervals as improving your aerobic capacity, but and your durability to a degree. But that's a little bit, I guess, a separate topic than from improving fat utilization, because they don't, one doesn't necessarily impact the other directly. Because if we're doing threshold workouts, we're not using a whole lot of fat. We're
You're
not,
using a bunch of glycogen, muscle glycogen,
yeah,
and exogenous
yeah,
carbohydrate. Yep.
yeah,
Yep.
right. And so fat isn't really a limiter in those workouts. It's more or even carbohydrates not a limiter in those workouts because they're not long enough that where we run out, generally speaking. So the biggest thing for most of these people that I'm working with is there's some sort of limit to the volume that they can do all the time. Like a professional athlete might have unlimited time, most other people don't. So we're just having to be strategic about how we can build their volume over time to get them in the best position possible with the time that they can commit to. Maybe that's not year round, it's at its highest point. Maybe it's just a build leading into their specific event, but that's a big target. And trying to focus those rides so that we're working on, to me, what I feel like is that main adaptation, improving fat burning capacity so that they can, if they can do 200 watts and that's where they burn the highest percentage of fat, raising that to where they can do that at 210, 220, whatever that number is, that's going to allow them to sustain that pace for longer.
Yeah. Yeah, agreed. And we'll get into like a little bit more of how you do that and in both later in this episode and also the nutrition episode. But let's turn to road real quick because you mentioned multiple disciplines with gravel. There's some that are 100, some that are like 150, some that are 200. Typical road racing, I'd say for masters, we're going to be anywhere between, really 40 to 100. Right. Elites will race longer than 100. But I'd say in general, like what are some of the differences in the road racing aspect of it? Is it more intense? Like tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean it's more intense. It's less a race of attrition. So it's more like just guys going hard for random reasons. You might or at least what seem random.
Right.
And because of that, you're doing all these micro efforts that are way above threshold that you really don't want to do, but they're just happening all the time. And I feel like that's generally the biggest difference is the fact that you're doing all these micro efforts. Now, the front of a gravel race, they still happen, but usually they happen because of terrain or something along those lines. Less likely guys are like just hitting it on the flat randomly. Like you might find in road racing, you just tend to get people thinking, "Oh, I'm going to get up the road and get in a breakaway," and so it just might come at any random time. Doesn't Sometimes it makes sense, other times it doesn't. But you get a lot of changing of pace. You'll have periods of a road race where it's easier than any training ride you've ever done, even your recovery days, and then the next minute it'll be the hardest thing you've ever done in your life. So it's very dynamic in terms of pacing.
Yes. And I think the word dynamic that's the best word for it, in my opinion, because like you said, you got the lulls, right? Because people are playing that chess game. So who's going to go win? Okay, I can draft, I can recover here, and that's part of the equation, right? And drafting is a much bigger component because because of the team tactics, because of the speed, because of terrain, all these kind of issues. And so I think saying that the road race is more dynamic, super important to realize, and also you're competing against, I'd say, other competitors on the road side of things versus a lot of people. I'd say most of the people are competing against the course itself in gravel, right? Very few are
Yeah.
competing mano a mano.
Yeah. I mean, in a road race, basically everybody has the same goal. Finishing isn't so much the goal in a road race, right?
Right.
Where in gravel, there's a component of just finishing as an achievement on itself in a road race. If you're dropped and you finish, usually that's not like no one cares. Only road race I can think of that maybe is wrong is Paris-Roubaix. For whatever reason, there's like
Yeah.
a big deal for guys to make it to the velodrome and finish. But otherwise, in road racing, if you're not in the front pack, you kind of it's you're not happy with how your day went. Where in gravel, that doesn't matter so much.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. And so I think like a lot of our listeners too, they're probably like, duh, like I get it. Right.
Hmm.
They see it, they watch it, they participate, they're racing it. And so why does kind of some all this matter, right? And we'll get into it because from a training standpoint, it actually matters in what you're trying to achieve and change. But the last thing I'll say that's kind of like different here is also gravel racing. You get aid stations, you get to stop, right? And in road racing, you don't. So
Right.
what's the difference there, and why does that matter when it comes into some of the training implications as well?
Yeah, or maybe even also just the fact you might have to carry all your nutrition for a really long time, where
Mm-hmm.
road racing, occasionally that is the case, but it's avoidable if you really want it to be. Like there's places for people to go and support you. Some of that isn't allowed in, some of the gravel events, or it's only allowed in very specific places. I think that matters quite a bit. It changes what you're going to choose for fuel, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
The pace is going to change what you choose for fuel to a degree too. Sometimes I feel like road racing, well, at least at the highest levels, everyone's doing the same thing just because the racing is just hard all the time, and then it makes it's hard to eat a rice cake when you're doing a max effort and you're breathing as hard as you've ever, you end up swallowing it into your lung or something like that. So, the choices become more limited.
Yeah, and I think too, just like, and we'll get into some of the training implications, but like, um, stopping at a gas station, eating all the things that are there, and training your gut to kind of handle whatever's laying around. That's a big implication that you don't really have to train on the road side of things. So
Right.
yeah, so I think like those aspects of how the road is just much more dynamic, especially in intensity, especially in like the game that's being played. I think that's super important. The technical terrain, as well as just like the sheer length and the pacing, is critical when you're training for a gravel event. And then finally, when you're deploying like a fueling situation, you got to know what you're working with. You got to know when you're going to stop, when you're not, what you need to carry, and all this kind of stuff. So we're going to take that slurry of differences
Right.
and get into the good stuff here with the training implications. So we're talking about like longer versus shorter here. Duration really is what we probably are talking about versus just mileage. But when you're
Right.
working with somebody prepping for a gravel event, let's take the Unbound 200, like you talked about. Um, what's the training looking like? Are you just like, man, we need long rides all the time, January onward, or like how do you start to organize some of this training for someone?
Yeah. I mean, I guess it starts out with where you're coming from. Do you have winter, and what are the implications of that and being able to get outside? 'Cause as much as I've seen and had athletes that'll ride 6 hours on the trainer, I don't think it's unlikely that keeps them wanting to ride year round. So I don't necessarily impose that as like a you must. So yeah, I try to keep it, if we can have like a basic, where you're riding 2.5, 3 hours, try to best we can start off as that kind of being the baseline for weekends. And once the weather gets nicer, then start to slowly build that. To maybe getting to like if we're talking about Unbound, maybe get to where we're doing the 7 or 8 hour and on one day, a 4 or 5 hour on the other day, to kind of match or get close to the sort of volume they might need to do in the race. And ideally have that done kind of in this time frame, given that it's basically in 2 or 3 weeks from now, so that we have time
Mm-hmm.
to
Yeah.
unpack some of that load too. It's a little
Yeah.
more challenging for an event that's, this time frame or earlier, for those people that don't have, that aren't in California and have, weather that allows them to start doing that build a little bit sooner. So that's probably one of the bigger challenges for some people, is just which event they're choosing and the time they have to get there.
So
Um,
what about somebody like myself? I will never in my life do 6 hours on the trainer. Never in
right.
my life.
And I don't think that's a problem.
But I also said that I'd never do the Unbound 200. So let's just say like a time crunched athlete, maybe the 100 looks a little bit
Yeah.
more reasonable, but like 6 to 8 hours of training, maybe they can squeeze out 10 to 12. Are you still going to deploy a similar strategy like January, February, with just like try to like max the duration of a trainer ride if they're living in some colder temperatures? What's
Well,
your
I mean, if
strategy there?
if it's shorter again, then we're not limited to the same degree, like to get ready for 100, as 200, just the total volume isn't the same restriction. We're probably still going to try to build to get, with that athlete, we might be able to get close to, 5 or 6 hour training sessions um, before their ride without too much difficulty, or at least gets close to similar volume of that one race day over the course of 2 training days.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll try to wait until winter is over. I mean, this year, if we look at this year as an example, it's kind of a long winter for a lot of people. So it's not been uncommon for a lot of people not to be able to get out until mid-March or April. And so maybe a little bit late start for some of those longer miles. I guess it just depends on the event. The earliest events of the year is something for gravel is like mid-south. The big ones are like mid-south or BWR San Diego. And those become a little more challenging for someone coming from the cold. But mid-south being a little bit shorter makes it so we can get a 4 hour ride potentially. If it's someone that has really bad weather, maybe we're splitting a ride up, part of it indoors, part of it outdoors, to sort of, like you say, you'll never do a 6 hour ride on the trainer, but will you do two?
Never.
And maybe you get 2 indoors, 2 outdoors because it's too cold to do it all outside. You just do the best you can. But ultimately, ultimately getting as much volume as we can in a way that doesn't like disrupt the rest of training. We got to take the full picture of what's possible with the athlete, and then we build it, slowly over time. I never like to add more than an hour to someone's week, from week to week.
Yep.
Yeah. And someone that's getting less volume, I may do maybe it's only half-hour steps because the percentage of total is a little bit more than for those people. Yeah. But that's kind of what I'm thinking. So you look at your event, kind of work backwards, and like how many weeks do I need to get to where I want, while still giving a week or two buffer so we can unload some of that long training so they're fresh for the race too.
Yeah, no, exactly. You said 2 things there that I think are really important for our audience. And the first one is trying to achieve about the same volume in a block of training. It can come on a weekend or midweek, depending on when your time is to train. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? Let's say someone's aiming for the Unbound 100 and their goal time is like 6 or 7 hours. What would a typical weekend look like for them? What should their highest weekend be?
Yeah, I mean, maybe we're just getting to that maybe just a little bit longer to mimic the fact that they're probably riding at a higher intensity for the race, so the total expenditure is a little bit higher than what they do on a normal training ride. But trying to just get, if we can match it or slightly exceed it, that would be a main goal. So I mean, for a lot of people, that means maybe 2 4-hour rides. Maybe we stack one a little bit longer so it's a little more similar to what their race is. Or sort of getting that durability through shorter sessions that allow the quality to stay higher. And they're still dealing with fatigue on day 2. That's sort of similar to some of the stuff they're going to be presented with on race day when they're tired too.
Yeah. And so folks, what Jason's talking about there is like, if you stack one more, right? Like, so say like a 5 and a 3 or a 5 and a 2, meaning day 1 is 5 hours long. Day 2 is 2 hours long, or like 4 and the 4. If you train within 24 hours of each other, or those sessions come day after day like that, you're not going to fully recover, so that there's this incremental stress that's kind of like adding up in the body. And that can be just as beneficial, if not more, like you said, because you keep quality high versus, oh my gosh, I'm going to have to suffer for 7.5 hours out there, so I'm just going to go do a 7.5 hour ride. Typically for a time crunched athlete, they go out and they're just like fading and dying at hour 5 if they do that, right?
And they might then kind of hose their whole next week. Like you get where the training rides are too big compared to their typical volume, and it's more problematic on a whole than like, yeah, sure, it matches their race distance, but it means they have like a week and a half where they're kind of worthless for regular training.
Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, so that's a really good, I think, benchmark for a lot of people trying to figure out the volume and how to prepare for some of these events. So how about road racing? Is that the same? where you would stack volume like that, or what kind of metrics are you looking at when you're preparing somebody for let's just assume a 1 day road race that's around 100 miles or so?
For a 1 day road race, a lot of times, and I do this to a degree too with some gravel people as well, where I'll try to match try to work on the kilojoule and getting a matching sort of kilojoule compared to the race length.
Mm-hmm.
So like in the same sort of time frame, but doing it in a steady manner versus like the way it happens in a race. So we might be riding a little bit higher pace. Let's say they end up averaging, they need to be able to average 250. Like that's kind of what their race average would work out to. But in a race, it's going to be really dramatic how they do that. I may have some rides where we do 250 for similar length, but most of the time, even if a road race is 100 miles on the road, that's happening in under 5 hours, maybe closer to 4 hours. So the length of these rides isn't quite the same. Like it's not apples to apples when we're saying 100 miles for a road race and 100 miles for, a gravel race. They just don't, the paces aren't the same. Like we go faster. And there tends to be more guys staying packed together in a road race, which helps keep that collective speed higher in general. So I'll have we have rides like that are sort of getting used to like the amount of work that you're going to have to do for that time frame. But otherwise, most of the other longer volume training is pretty similar, to be honest. And again, comes kind of back to the restraints they have with how much time they have available. But otherwise, it tends to be pretty similar. Like we're still, for me, I look at those long rides as being a chance to continue to improve that ability to use fat. And so we're working at intensities that optimize fat utilization. So we need to burn a lot of fat to get good at utilizing it. But otherwise, the other thing is just kilojoule expenditure, total workload that they're doing. That's kind of the other component I'm really considering with the longer rides is how much volume does this add to their expenditure?
Yeah, I'd agree, especially as you're just like in that base and build phase, kind of doesn't matter. And kilojoule expenditure is a good way to look at that. In average power as you go. And I'm looking at kind of growing FTP as we go in aerobic capacity. But I'd say like, if someone's going to be road racing kind of in that build to kind of the end of the build phase where we're getting ready to race, I mean, doing group rides is honestly some of the best stuff, right? Because that's going to give that dynamic aspect of training. It's different than intervals because it's not structured. You don't know when it's coming. You have to get on wheels. You have to be in the moment. And there's a lot of like flow and kind of like mental stuff that goes on. And I think that a lot of people don't do that though, because they don't live in areas where they can get to, group rides on a regular basis to get that spontaneous intensity. So with an athlete like that, Jason, are you working intensity into a specific long ride for them, or is it just like, hey, do all these kilojoules and we'll call it good?
I typically I would search out some other events that they can race ahead of their key events, so they get some race prep. Because, like you say, like the nature of how you get it on a group ride is hard to replicate on your own, mainly because you're not the one dictating the pace. Like you don't get to choose when to do the effort or when the effort finishes. So it's really hard to replicate on your own. At some of the high level, you might see like motor pacing or something like that. But for most people, that's not really an option. So I would most of the time I'd try to find some other event that they can jump into if they don't have, a local good, group to do a good, group rides with. I'd look for some racing to do it. And even if they only have like crit racing, you could ride some before, ride some after to mix the volume with the sporadic intensity that you get from riding with others. So
yeah, for sure. Agree with all that. I'd say I'll throw in this because I've had some athletes in that scenario, and one like simple workout, if you're trying to get ready for some of that spontaneous intensity over a long course, is pick out pick out like a lumpy sort of course, like a rolling terrain, not just like all 20, 30-minute hill climbs like you
Right.
got out there in the West. That would be a luxury out here. But pick like a lumpy one. So, 3, 5, 7-minute hill climbs and just attack at the top, just like a really hard effort, 20, 30 seconds as you're coming over the top. Keep the speed on the down, cruise, and then you're riding tempo or threshold up. You attack over the next top, and then throw in a couple like town sprint signs or like county line sprints, or just like random, like you're kind of out sprinting yourself. I
Right.
think that's some of the best way to do it if you don't got any wheels or, training partners or something like that. So if
Yeah, I
anybody
mean,
is solo training a bunch, try that.
right. Yeah. I mean, when all else fails, like you can find ways to kind of make your own course or make your own,
Yeah.
you know, the sprints or the hill climbs, you can just go and smash yourself and try to keep the pace high after and still do a big ride and challenge yourself
Yeah.
that way.
Yeah. If anybody sees you out there, they're probably wondering what the heck you're doing,
Yeah, right.
but let's swing it back to gravel. We talked about some of the main energy systems and the pacing. You've mentioned a couple times burning as much fat as possible. In a remote setting like you are, how do you identify what that point is for maximizing a fat burning production? Or do you just do it like through power and that that's the pace for the athlete?
I mean, ideally, it's some sort of testing first to sort of identify it. I will at times use some generalizations for people with heart rate, and but I mean, their heart rates kind of have to fall into sort of normal, bell curve of heart rate data. You might have someone that has crazy high heart rates all the time or crazy low, and I might not be able to quite use it the same way, but generally speaking, like if you can ride at a steady pace and your heart rate doesn't continue to climb to infinity, like if you ride at, say we ride at 175 watts and your heart rate gets to a certain number, but then kind of stays there, then that's probably close to the where we want. Or if it only drifts a handful of beats, then we're probably in the ballpark for where we want to be. Tends that to me, that's maybe into the low 130s. If we start getting above 140, then in most cases we're seeing people sort of switching from burning primarily fat to more carbohydrate. But this is just sort of roundabout, it's just ballpark sort of thing. You can try to use, power duration curve if you've done numerous distant max sort of efforts to give you some clues to it as well. The best would be some sort of lab testing, some lactate testing, that sort of thing can help identify that the best.
And I don't know if this is accurate or not, but this is something that I do for these long, steady ones. It's just you warm up, you get into a steady scenario, right? Probably
Mm-hmm.
not the lumpy course. You're not going to attack yourself like we talked about,
Right.
like the roadies doing. But I just have them target the upper end of endurance miles power. And so, roughly 70, 76% of their FTP. And I say, target that and keep the perceived effort somewhere around, 5 or 6. So it's like high aerobic. And I just tell them to go just and keep that average and focus on high average power at the upper end of endurance miles. And I'll do long rides there and just try to extend that out. And I think of it as an extensive aerobic development time period. I don't know if that's right. I don't know if that burns fat exclusively. You can
Yeah,
tell
I
me if I'm
mean,
wrong or not, but
well, I mean, at least the way I kind of view it is if we're riding at intensity that utilizes fat, we're going to see more like linear heart rate relationship,
yeah,
meaning it's going to stay relatively the same, or if it climbs, it's just a little bit, a little bit. It's not going to be, if we're riding, I'll just use the same number. If we're riding at 175 and your heart rate early on is 120, if later on it's 160, then we know that you probably weren't burning fat the whole time, or that you got too tired, your aerobic muscle fibers got too tired and they needed help. And then we know we're not using just fat anymore, because those other fibers don't use fat as a fuel source.
exactly. And so if your heart rate remains steady and consistent all day, it plays on the whole thing that you said at the very beginning where, yeah, gravel, it's longer. Generally, it's more aerobic in nature. And that's how you can kind of tease that out in training, right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the long high end endurance maybe attacks the type of fuel utilization from the other end of the spectrum, or more by running out of carbohydrate potentially, where we can't keep up with the demands. And then you kind of get to the same place. If you run out of carbohydrate, what has to get better is using fat. I don't know. I don't, that route, I do less. I don't do those every time because I feel like that's
Correct.
pretty
Yes.
tiring.
Yes.
And I'll try to mix those in. It depends on the person, because if someone doesn't race at all, I feel like mixing those in becomes a lot more important. Otherwise, we're just not going to get it through, just the doing a lot of events. Someone that does a lot of events and does a lot of races and pushes themselves quite often, we kind of get some of that just by their choice of doing a lot of events. So it kind of comes back to that individuality of, if someone's only targeting 2 events and that's all they do, then we're going to have to do some more higher intensity, longer rides. Because otherwise, our body, even if we get better, we still, like let's say we do a training block and now we're better. If we've still never actually gone and done those numbers, it doesn't make it where we're good at it. Like anything,
Mm-hmm.
if you might be capable of something, but it doesn't mean you're good at it if you've only done it one time, right? Like to get good, it's going to take more experience. And I feel like that's
Yeah.
true even with our energy systems. Like they're going to be more robust to handle a workload if you've done it 10 times versus if you only done it once.
Yeah. That's, oh man, if our listeners can replay that and listen to it again, it's gold, right? And so what he's saying there is like, don't think you can just ride zone 2, go do a couple VO2 efforts and then go bike racing. Like there's a lot of other nuances that go on there. And like I said, targeting that upper end endurance and just getting super grindy for a very long period, as long as you can. Don't do it every weekend, but you got to do that sometimes because there's a lot of benefit that can be gleaned there. And I do that for both road racers and gravel, but I find that the applicability for gravel and triathletes works pretty good.
Yeah, I mean, it's basically matching what they're going to do in their race, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Sport fest specificity. So let's swing it back to the road here real quick, and then I think we're gonna wrap up and call it good for this part one. But from the road side of things, we shared a couple key workouts. We mentioned that it's just much more dynamic. But what are some of the key metrics that you're looking at? What are you trying to improve with just an all-arounder road racer if you want to equip them for a 70 or 100-mile road race?
I mean, ultimately, there's, I'd say, kind of two things I'm paying attention to. So I always like to say there's a level you have to reach sort of FTP wise to be in the game, unless it's just a purely flat course. But even then, there's like a level you have to be at this level, or you're probably not going to be good enough to make it to the end. And then that shorter term power tends to be what defines who does well. And then, not everybody's a sprinter, but you then try to play to your strengths, but improving more of that shorter term power and maybe teaching people how to do tacks like gearing. Some of that specific, I think, gets lost on people a lot and
Mm-hmm.
playing to their strengths. But we're generally talking stuff 5 minutes and less is ultimately where a road race is won and lost. It's in those sort of efforts. So there's a lot more emphasis on those, particularly through the season when we're racing, is doing those really high intense efforts. And there's a little more nuance in talking about tactics, where there's a little less tactics on the gravel side. It's like, hey, can you ride your hard pace and keep doing that and do that the whole day? Where on the road, timing and being able to put your big effort at the right place matters a lot.
I agree with that for sure. And it's not as simplistic as this, but if you got a huge FTP and you got a lot of miles in the legs for gravel racing, that's what I'm looking at. For road racing, you need to have the miles in the legs, but your 1 minute power, 5 minute power, and depending on your phenotype, but like if you're going to be sprinting, we got to look at 20-second power too. And I think that's where, and I've on this podcast, I've talked about FTP and FRC, their relationship. if you're using some of those metrics in WKO5 or Training Peaks and your coach is working with that, a marriage or a blend of FTP and FRC for a road racer is really good. I'd say, high FTP and high stamina for a gravel racer. Those are the things I look at.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, I think an interesting concept to think of is you can make your threshold higher, but it comes at the expense of your how explosive you are.
Mm-hmm.
So you're really balancing that. So for the gravel guy, generally being explosive isn't the key to success. So you really double down on the durability and being able to do those efforts longer. Or on the road racing side, you just need to be durable enough to get to the finish, but then it's have that explosive, maximizing your explosive characteristics to the racing. So I mean, a road racer is different than say a criterium racer. Like on a criterium racer, you're going to err way more on the explosive side than you are on the threshold side. In the road racer, you may be a little more in the middle because you still need a bit of both.
So with the explosiveness for a road racer that still needs to have some decent FTP and overall fitness, is there a key workout that you use for your road racers to, I'd say, either develop that or make sure they have that come race day?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's what we call speed intervals.
Hmm.
I typically like 40-20, so it's like 40 seconds on, 20 seconds easy. I like to kind of do those in like 10-minute, so it's like 10 effort blocks.
Mm-hmm.
And so that way we're kind of getting a mix of there's a little bit of a threshold aspect because you're doing 10 minutes of that at a time, but still the effort that we're doing within them is above threshold the whole time. You're getting mini breaks, so it makes it a little more sustainable. If we're, it's one of these things that's a bit of a blend. I think one of the things I always tell athletes when they're doing it is it's preparing them to be having periods where they're at high levels of lactate, but still having to go. And that's what happens at the end of these races. And so I think that's a really good prep that's balancing, there's still a threshold component because of how many and the length of time you're doing it for, but also you're doing those big efforts that are above threshold that are going to be part of any road race.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good answer. And 40-20s are hard when done properly, for sure. I use those as well. I'd say from my standpoint, I just go back to the group ride, man. Just try to win the group ride. Try to survive the group ride if you can't, if you've been struggling.
Right.
But
Right.
I do think if you're in a community with a rich like group ride on Saturday or midweek or something like that, and if you got some road race goals, jump in that, go hard.
Sure.
Yep.
Totally agree.
All right, Jason. Well, to take this thing home, let's bring some summary points to this, and keep in mind for our listeners, this is part 1 of 2 when we're talking about the differences between gravel and road racing. And today we talked about how duration and intensity play some really key roles when you're trying to determine how best to prepare for gravel or road. Generally, gravel events are longer, and the training should be really on that aerobic foundation, finding some good pacing for the duration or distance that the gravel is going to be done, FTP work, long ride development. The road race, it's more dynamic, so there's more stuff going on there. But is there anything else that you want to add to some of these summary points here, Jason?
I guess the only thing I'd say is like when we talk FTP workouts for the gravel racer is
Mm-hmm.
trying to push to where the interval lengths are longer because the effort,
Yes.
all the efforts they're doing are longer, more sustained in nature. So I'm trying to make it a more aerobic based challenge all the way around where, when we get to the road racing, we maybe start out doing some of that stuff, but we definitely, as race season starts, we go to shorter, higher intensity, and there's a much bigger portion of their time spent doing that stuff.
Yeah, that's a great aspect to bring in, especially in a summary. But I preach on a lot of people in our audience here. It's like for threshold work, get out of that 20-minute box, right? Go 25, go 30, go 60 minutes. Just go as long as you can at that. And that'll, for gravel, that's really good. I think that there's a component that you can do in that if you're racing road, but to the point of road being more dynamic and being more anaerobic in general, I'm going to shorten that FTP work and just try to raise the FTP rather than lengthen it. So that's a really good point. Yep. Well, good, Jason. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to have you back to talk about fueling for gravel and roads. So thank you, Jason.
Thank you.